Um, I have to tell you first, let me give credit where credit is due. I am not an architect. I do not play an architect on TV or anywhere else. I do, however, have an appreciation for the beautiful and historic history of our county. Sometimes odd buildings. Okay. When I started collecting information about buildings, it was for some sidewalk and tram tours that we were, that the museum was sponsoring, and I nearly drove a local architect, Kurt Gardner, crazy. Oh, God bless him. I had endless questions, and he just patiently answered them. It was always at the end of an email, or I could call him on the phone. And he delivered really a short course in architecture, especially the features and the history of architecture. I hope I don't embarrass him today, so maybe you don't want to tell him how I did. But he even gave me a book about architectural styles in hopes, I think, that I would quit bothering him. And I still love that book. I use it all the time. So thank you, Kurt, wherever you are, and I hope I set everything right today. The logical place to start to talk about Marshall County architecture would be with the courthouse. It was completed in 1872, and the architect was Gurdon P. Randall from Chicago. And the cost at the time was, get ready for this, the princely sum of $109,254. Now, in today's dollars, that would be $2,816,783. Isn't the internet a wonderful thing? Yeah.
Never get it for that.
No, yeah, no. It has been renovated several times in the intervening years, most recently just a couple of years ago when the clock tower was rebuilt. It is truly a mix of architectural styles, which reminds me to tell you that according to Kurt, buildings are built and paid for by people. And because of that, they all have their personal ideas and particular ideas about what they like. So architects and contractors are employees who generally aim to please. So strict adherence to a particular architectural style is much rarer than a mix of elements that somehow work together to make up a whole. Sometimes they don't work together very well, according to some people, but others like what they like. So our courthouse has some features. I took everything off of here and then suddenly stuff appeared. Some of the features of our particular courthouse are neoclassical in design. And by neoclassical, I mean like the triangular pediments above the doors, the Corinthian columns in front. Some features are Victorian design, such as the tall windows with the ornamental hoods above the windows and what they call vermiculated coins at the corner. Now, vermiculated coins are those things on the edges that are two colors. If you look at our courthouse, you'll see that it's brick and then limestone and brick and limestone. Well, those are coins with a Q, Q-U-I-N, Q-U-O-I-N-S. And that wonderful clock tower blends elements of several styles and defies pigeonholing altogether. I think it was just whatever Gurdon P. Randall had in his head, but it works really well. And now what you're looking at here, isn't that just a wonderful picture? Well, it's from 1856. So that is the oldest brick building in the downtown area that is still standing. It is Italianate in style, built originally by Amsey Wheeler. Now, Amsey Wheeler was the same guy that built what is now the Reese Theater and the Nari building down here. He built those in 1865. This one was earlier than that. And the buildings on either side in this picture are both wooden buildings, and they have long since gone by the wayside. But this building was brick because it was built to be the first bank in Plymouth. So of course, it needed to be a little, it was expected to be a little more secure than a wooden building. Now look at this picture. You see that yellowish building there? If you look really carefully, you can see that it has steps up the front. And you can tell that it sits back on the lot farther than the buildings around it. And in 1901, a German immigrant by the name of John Berkman bought this building and began a tailoring and dry cleaning business. Then, in 1914, he remodeled, dismantling the facade, just took it apart in pieces, set it aside, and built the building forward by 5 feet, and then he put the facade back on so that it would then match the line of the other buildings on the street. And he lowered the floor level so that it was street level and eliminated the steps in the front. Kind of makes you wonder how they managed all that in 1914, doesn't it? I mean, that was heavy work. The building was eventually incorporated into the Bosworth's building and has remained open to the building to the south. So there's an inside entrance to that building. This building still exists 168 years later, and it houses Barry's Ice Cream. So next time you go in there, you just can think to yourself, gosh, this is the oldest building in Plymouth. Well, the oldest business building downtown, not necessarily the oldest building. But I promise we're not going to stay just in Plymouth. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk a bit about the current home of the Marshall County Museum. It started in 1910 as the home of the longtime men's store Lauer's, of course. Locals, you know Lauer's, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The building is neoclassical, designed by Jacob Ness, an architect who's responsible for several of our downtown buildings. You know a neoclassical building by the symmetrically balanced windows, a center door, usually there's a center door. The building's door now is on the corner, but when it was built, it was in the center. And I think you can see that in the picture. You can see where the doorway is. So that corner was cut out and made an entrance in like 1960 when Lauer's remodeled. Another clue to the neoclassical design is the rectangular windows with the 9-pane uppers and the boxed eave with an overhang and all those triangular pediments above the doors and in the roof line. So that is neoclassical. That is 100% neoclassical. It's even got some columns on the side door. And the ground floor and basement were used for the men's store, while the second floor was rental space for business offices. The door to the south was the way to get from the street level to the second floor. And currently that door, we don't let anybody in that door. It goes right straight up, but it's an emergency exit if we should need to use that. Moses Lauer ran the store, and his brother Leopold's law office was upstairs. Other tenants included Dr. Charles Welch, who was a dentist, Dr. Schaff, who had one of Marshall County's first x-ray machines, very cutting edge. I guess the story is that people would just make an appointment and go up to see Dr. Schaff so that they could see what they looked like inside. They didn't necessarily have a reason for an x-ray, but can you just imagine all that radiation that was necessary to make an x-ray back then? Pickle Smith was up there as well, and he was the Heinz pickle agent. Galeman Dexter was an attorney whose daughters still occasionally visit the museum. And Dr. Aspinall, the Pennsylvania Railroad doctor, was upstairs as well. If you're going to work for the railroad, you had to go see Dr. Aspinall to make sure you were sturdy enough for the work. There were many other tenants as well. And we've tried as much as we can to leave the names on the windows that were there from years ago. In many cases, we've taken the doors off the hinges for better access for our museum, but we still have the doors, and they're stored downstairs. Our building directly to the south, this is our museum building, and then where we're sitting right now is the one with the arrow. It was built in about 1895, so it predates the 1910 Lauer building, and it was a saloon for a guy named Spieshofer. The 20th century functional building replaced an earlier wood frame building that had burned to the ground. Functional building is just exactly that, just functional. No particular style, little attention to style or form. People who built functional buildings simply wanted to put their business in something, and they weren't willing to spend extra money on fancy or decorative details. Form followed function with these buildings, and we have several of them in Marshall County. Almost every, well, I will say every downtown has functional buildings. Sometime before the fire, in the old building, not where you're sitting, but in the building, the wooden building that was here before that, a shooting took place. Jacob Fernie was a bartender in an establishment down the street. And when a customer ran up a tab and left without paying, Fernie followed him into Spieshofer's place. I guess the guy just came down the street for another drink. And Fernie followed him and demanded payment. The deadbeat in question simply took out a gun and shot Mr. Furry. He jumped up, ran out the back door, and skipped town. He was never apprehended, and Jacob Fernie died a few hours later. Sad story, but you know, we've got blood in our soil on this particular place. Longtime Plymouth photographer Jesse Steele lived in an upstairs apartment for several years. And when Mr. Steele died, a good friend rescued a portion of his glass negatives, which were later donated to the museum. His granddaughter, who was the executor of his estate, later expressed gratitude to that kind friend, as she was really too young at the time to appreciate the history that was represented by those glass plates. Likely to her, there was just a bunch of junk, but somebody saved them for us. Now, and I'm telling you that because I want you to be on the lookout for a new exhibit that's set to open upstairs that features some of the history of photography in Marshall County, and it's a very rich history. So I would encourage you to come see that when the time comes when we get that open. And I'm sure it'll be on social media when that happens. Glass negatives will be part of that exhibit, and they are fascinating. We're thrilled to have our community center in this building now. Also on the second floor is our train room, along with several other exhibits. So make your way upstairs if you've not done that. The Marshall County Historical Society Genealogy Library now resides in this building over here. It is a Romanesque revival building that was built in 1896 for a Mr. W.W. Hill and his son Fred, and they ran a bakery in that building. Romanesque revival buildings usually have wide, round-topped arches over the windows, big windows with an arch over the top, squared stonework, and they usually have 2 or 3 colors of brick or stone in combination. This building has been painted, looks like in that particular picture, which is years old. But lots of times there's interesting color combinations on the front of those buildings. And they usually have a cornice and some decorative masonry panels. This was Mr. Hill's 3rd building on the same site. And at least one of the previous buildings that we can track had burned to the ground. You know, that was a very big problem with wooden buildings because, you know, they heated and lit their space with open fire. you know, first it was fireplaces, and then it was gas lamps. So it was a very big danger. And if you want to know more about that, we've got a whole display over here that you can read about that. The city of Plymouth has experienced at least 2 major downtown fires that took a number of buildings all at once. It is the same with other towns in Marshall County as well. It stands to reason that wooden buildings standing so close together would be unnatural to burn to the ground. Lighting, natural gas, and consequently city governments began to insist that new buildings could not be the cheaper wooden frame buildings, but they had to be brick. And that was an improvement that dramatically and fundamentally changed the character of downtown areas. And if you want more information about that, see our exhibit before November, because I think that's when it's changing. Mr. Hill ran a restaurant along with his bakery, and his banquet hall was on the 2nd floor, which is where our HCC is now. The 3rd floor, one of very few in the county, was a dance hall and a meeting room for local fraternal organizations. So I don't know what the piano player did to get his instrument up those stairs, but I'm assuming that might have not been part of the band. One of the older buildings in the downtown area, the balcony building, may have been built as early as the late 1860s. Now, according to the style of the era, it was an Italianate building, the most prominent features of which are usually tall, narrow windows, arched or curved tops, already mentioned that, and large and elaborate cornices at the top. But what you're seeing here is the only picture that we have of the actual balcony on the building. And it does not show the top cornice. You can see that it does have tall arched windows, and it looks to be 3-story. And it had 2 storefronts, but something happened. That's a more current picture from the mid-1980s. And yes, it is the same building. They hardly resemble each other. But look at the windows. That's kind of how you can tell. I always tell folks, if you want to see the history of a downtown area, look at the 2nd floor. Because our 1st floors are all glass and aluminum now, they've been replaced. But the 2nd floor usually shows the age and the style of the building. Something else, well, the something that happened was a catastrophic fire that took place in 1946. It completely destroyed the 3rd floor, which was the meeting place of the Moose Lodge. It is a testimony to the brick buildings that the fire did not spread to the buildings on either side. The 3rd floor was removed along with the Italianate cornice, and it became a 2-story structure. At the time of the fire, the G&G grocery store, you remember G&G, the G&G occupied the north half of the 1st floor, and the A&P grocery occupied the south half. Don't ask me to explain that, I have no idea. Currently, the building houses the Wild Rose Moon and Aldrich Diagnostic Medicine. The 2nd floor houses apartments up there. I would be surprised to learn that any of you could identify this building. It looks nothing like that now, but let me tell you about it. It is a 3-story, 3-bay building that was known as the Wheeler Building. And it is one of the oldest remaining downtown buildings. It was built in 1865 in a 19th century functional style. No frills, no particular style. Once again, by Amzie Wheeler. He was the guy that built the first brick building in town. It was built on plot number 1 on the original plat map from 1837. Now this picture shows a soldier's funeral coming around the corner, although probably not a Civil War funeral, probably not that era. the light post suggests that it possibly was in a gaslight era or maybe early electrification. It could have been the funeral of a Civil War veteran, however. Probably the reason this picture was made had to do with the sign on the building. It is for Johnson Brothers Furniture and Funeral Services. I don't think you can probably read the sign. Very often, the furniture dealer was also the funeral director. Something to do with knocking stuff together with wood, I guess. But we know this building today as the Reese Theater. It got a complete overhaul, including an entirely new facade in 1939 when Stuart Reese bought 2 of the 3 storefront bays. He gutted the inside, took off the 3rd floor, installed a new Art Deco front, and created a 1,000 square foot luxury apartment above the auditorium, which is where the Reeses lived. The feature for opening night was Remember the Night, and movies were shown there until about 2007. Now, of course, the building has reopened as the event center in our beautiful restored Reese Theater. If you've not been in there, that's fabulous, and you really should make it. If you don't have a reason to go, make a reason to go to see the Reese. And this picture clearly shows the building next door to the Reese, which was once the north bay of the same 1865 building. Imagine that building going all the way to the corner. Amzie Wheeler first built a frame building on lot number 1 of the town plat, later replacing it with the brick one. The 3rd floor was home to the International Order of Oddfellows. The Johnson Brothers operated out of the 1st floor and probably had an embalming room on the 2nd floor. The remaining North Bay was occupied by several businesses, most notably Merriman's Grocery from 1939 to 1966. And then I think it became Grolick's Grocery there as well. At some point after 1939, the 3rd floor was removed. Nari Simple Treasures is in that building now. And here is a beautiful picture of our restored Reese. Now, the buildings that now house the Chamber of Commerce and the city offices were originally built as one big 3-bay building in 1879. It was a huge Italianate structure with a facade that was dominated by wrought iron details. Doesn't look Italianate, wouldn't you say, from my wonderful teaching that is neoclassical? Yeah, well, that's what it used to look like. You see the Simons building there for reference? The Simons building is next to that 2-story, 3-bay building, and the Simons building is still right straight across the street from where we are. The original building was built in 1879 for Marcus A.O. Packard, who was a local lawyer and a politician who also founded the First National Bank, for which he commissioned the building. But in 1916, the original Italianate facade was covered over on the 2 north bays with a limestone and granite neoclassical facade. Because the style of the day favored those things, your bank should suggest strength and confidence and permanence, apparently more than brick and iron. You wanted to see evident the granite and limestone and all of those neoclassical details. Jacob Ness was the architect, a proponent of neoclassical design and builder of several of Plymouth's downtown buildings. If you want to see evidence of the original building, take a minute or 2 when you leave here to look down the Garrow Street side. You can see the original style of the building on the 2nd floor, but you have to look down the side of the building. In addition to the bank and A.O. Packard's law offices, the first long-distance telephone office and Tanner Drug Store occupied space in these 3 bays. The building was donated to the city in 1975 and has housed the city offices since then. Don's Sporting Goods operated out of the southern port for a long time as well. That's where the Chamber of Commerce is now, I think. So here's the two facades, side by side. And you can kind of see the Garrow Street windows. You can track that from that photo, you can see what I'm talking about. Now this is one of the most interesting buildings in downtown. It was built in 1929. Once again, it's a Jacob Ness building, but it is not neoclassical. It is something called Beaux-Arts in style. It was built as the first retail outlet for Montgomery wards in the whole country. It opened 3 days before the stock market crash, but somehow it survived the Great Depression. The design of this building became the standard for their chain of stores. So you can see similar buildings in other places. Featured high on the center bay is a framed, low relief sculpture called the Spirit of Progress, which became an early Montgomery Ward trademark. It was truly state of the art, featuring a pneumatic tube system for sending orders. Some may remember that, yeah. You could get your receipts, other kinds of paperwork from department to department. Treats for Her operated out of that building in the 1970s and 80s. The building is currently home to Heartland Artists, and we could not be more happy about that. It's the perfect home for Heartland Artists because it's such a stylish building. So that's what it looks like now, and you can see that Spirit of Progress at the top. The sculpted top, the color panels, rounded corner windows, and the glazed tile are all Beaux-Arts style, which you can kind of see, it preceded the Art Deco craze that came along in the 1930s. But you can kind of see where Art Deco came from if you see the Beaux-Arts. So who remembers the turret and the watchtower on the top of this building? You might not, because maybe you never looked up. But believe it or not, this building, built in 1900, it is considered 19th century functional. Fancy for a functional building. But because of that castellated turret and tower, that's the only detail on there that's really, that departs from the functional style. The facade was created for the Knights of Pythias, a men's civic organization, very active at the time, and met on the second floor. The building has served mostly as restaurants. The Red Top, the Candy Kitchen, F&F Coffee Shop into the 1960s. Currently, it's part of the Brass Rail. It lost its turret and its tower in the 1960s because they started throwing bricks down onto the sidewalk. How rude.
Yes.
As promised, we're moving out of the city of Plymouth now. Time flies. If there is one particular feature that the town of Bourbon is known for, it's probably its beautiful brick homes and churches. There are several up and down Main Street, but I chose this one, built in 1914 because of its Gothic revival style. The square towers that flank the front gable have castellated parapets, which is typical of Gothic revival. A third tower on the side is also castellated. The gables and the pointed arches are meant to point heavenward, and the stepped buttresses on either side of the building and the stone details lend to the building's air of permanence. Originally left open, the bell tower's windows are now covered by wooden louver panels. A little hard to keep the pigeons out of there without some kind of covering. The south end of the building, on the left side of the photo, you Bourbon people know what's going on with that, don't you? Yeah. The south end of the building was designed as the church parsonage, and it has a full flat-topped porch on that end. Many of the stained glass windows have transoms presumably to allow for airflow during the hot summer months. The two stepped windows on the north side of the entry tower, you can kind of see them there. They suggest that there's a stairway there, and that's the interior staircase that goes to the tower. Now this Bourbon home.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
On the church, could you show me where the buttresses are?
Well, you can't, they're short buttresses. I think I'm supposed to have a pointer here. These are the buttresses. You know, we're used to flying buttresses, which go way out into the yard. They're not flying buttresses, they're just plain buttresses.
Okay.
If they had more wing, they could fly. This Bourbon home, isn't that pretty?
Yes.
It's a beautiful home. It was completed in 1881 for Isaac B. and Ruth Arnold. And it is a 3-story brick Queen Anne styled home, once termed a palatial mansion, and was the first house in Marshall County with steam heat and gas lights. Very fancy. You see the front facing gable? It has what they called spindle work up in the point. And that small 2nd-story porch, the bay window, big fancy front porch, those details and many more are typical of Queen Anne. Most of us have some kind of an idea of what we think a Queen Anne home would look like. It was built by carpenter R.L. Spencer in what was called then the Eastlake style. And it was designed by architect W.S. Matthews of Ohio, who did a lot of buildings in Bourbon. The home's exterior is made of pressed brick, reportedly imported from Ohio, although Bourbon had its own brickworks. So I don't know why. I guess if you have enough money, you can do anything you want. So apparently the residents wanted brick from Ohio. The original roof was made of tricolored slate roof caps, and the house has a full basement and attic. 14 finished rooms with 11-foot ceilings on the 1st and 2nd floors. I do not want to be responsible for cleaning a 14-room house. And I'm sure most of us would agree, that's a little much. But of course, back then, people had staff. A bridal staircase made of walnut and butternut greets guests at the front foyer, and similar butternut woodwork was used throughout the house. The home includes pocket doors, 2 elaborate slate fireplaces and with gold accents and painted details, as well as bay windows with intricate window frames. Beautiful. This is one, you know, we might consider for a house tour sometime.
Yeah,
it's just a beautiful,
that would be great.
Beautiful house. Now this one, I love this house. Look at the massive size of that bungalow. It was built for James Fribley and his family in 1920. And by 1920, bungalow was the style. Yeah, it's 2.5 stories, brown brick, and it's a classic example of craftsman bungalow. Broad side gables, low-pitched roof with a wide overhanging eaves are typical craftsman features, as are the large front porch and the stone-capped porch piers. Rectangular windows and generally symmetrical features. I love this picture because it just shows how massive this house is, and because the Fribley family are all out on the porch. You know, at the time, you might only get one picture in your whole life of your family. And they chose their house to be photographed with them. Local Bourbon architect Matthew Irwin built this Dutch colonial home. That's Irwin with an E, not Irwin with an I. It dates from 1890, and it's the only Dutch colonial building featured in our little tour here. But I wanted to use it because it is Dutch colonial. It's not a predominant style for the area. There are a few other examples in Marshall County. It features the gambrel roof with little eave overhang and prominent stonework and the end chimney. You know, that's kind of associated with that particular style. The entryway is on the non-gambrel side and features a porte cochere. Often this style features custom windows that flank the chimney. As you can see here in the third story, those windows are a little bit different. So they're custom. Notice the little girl standing at the gate. You kind of miss her if you're not looking for her. Isn't she cute? Yeah. Oh, here we go. We're leaving Bourbon, going to Argus. I'm showing you this building because Argus made its mark on the county in the early 20th century with the National Retail Hardware Association. Probably don't know that, but Argus was the home of the National Retail Hardware Association. Melvin Lake Corey, who owned a hardware store in Argus, became the secretary of that organization. And that was retailers and wholesalers, manufacturers of hardware, and it became a powerful force in the hardware business in the early 1900s, largely due to Mr. Corey's efforts. It was his influence that brought the association's headquarters to Argus. This was their building. The NRHA headquarters in turn sparked a housing boom of that era that included many of the beautiful craftsman homes that feature stonework porches and chimneys in Argus. If you've driven through Argus, you know what I'm talking about. And those homes, those craftsman bungalows, were executive homes for the executives that moved with Hardware Association into Argus. Craftsman style bungalows feature low-pitched gable roofs with wide, unenclosed eave overhangs and rafters that were usually exposed. They have full or partial width porches with a roof supported by tapered square columns that go clear to the ground. The windows are generally multi-pane sash windows. And I'm going to show you some of those. But by the way, the Hardware Association building is still in Argus. Anybody recognize that building?
They took the top off.
Probably not, because they took the top off.
Oh, no.
Oh, my.
I know, right? And I'll have to check with my husband here, but isn't that the building that had the fire?
As I understand it, it was a fire,
Yeah.
yeah, took the top off.
Yeah. Mhm.
What is it?
Well, we don't know what it is now.
I don't think
Yeah.
it's.
I think it's a storage building.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. It lost its upper floor sometime in the 60s or something. It's not nearly as imposing, is it? No. William Lake Folker was the most accomplished of several stonemasons working in the Argus community and in our area right around the turn of the 20th century. Born in Plymouth in 1857, Mr. Folker moved to Argus as a child and eventually went to work as a plasterer and a bricklayer. Accounts from his daughter, Edna, state that he read a newspaper article about the construction of a mansion in South Bend that was employing French stonecutters, and he decided to go up and watch them. And he stayed several weeks in South Bend just observing the technique of cutting and assembling color in the walls of the new house. We don't really know, but kind of think it might have been the Oliver Mansion that he watched being built. Working in both cut and uncut stone, Folker harvested most of his materials from farmers' fields right around Argus. No full record of his work has ever been compiled. We're sorry about that. We would love to have known where all he went and what houses he contributed to. But several characteristics of his work make it identifiable. If you know Argus, you know this house. It's right on 10, you can't miss it. It's on Indiana, yeah. It's Indiana Avenue, right. One thing that's identifiable is the tapered appearance of his porch walls and the piers, giving the illusion of a naturally occurring pile of stones. Another is his skill in blending a variety of colors and his unique ability to fit cut stones very tightly together. Folker nearly always placed a pudding stone in his stonework. Now, I have a picture up there in the corner of a pudding stone. It's a usually white quartz with red jasper streaks or spots in it. While a good deal of Folker's work is concentrated in Argus, his talent propelled his career to many places outside the county. There are Folker homes in Plymouth and Kewanee, Mulberry, Kokomo, Rochester, Bass Lake, Gary, and even Chicago boast Folker stonework. And this was the home that William Folker built for his own family. He began planning the construction in 1912, and it was nearly 5 years before the family moved in. He gathered the stone while traveling all over northern Indiana, and some consider this cut stone house to be the crowning achievement of his career. The stones were so varied that the whole house is constructed without any two similar stones set close to each other. One of the features of the chimney is that it uses the two halves of one stone placed opposite each other, like a book. But the most striking feature of Folker's masonry is found in almost all his chimneys, and that is he had these trademark patterns, the Wheel of Life and the Star of Hope, both of which reflected his philosophical beliefs, and they are very prominent in the chimney of his own house. You can see the Wheel of Life down closer to the bottom, and then up, you see the red stone in the middle. If you look carefully, and this picture isn't the best for that, but you can see it's set like a star. If you've been to Argus, you can't have missed this one. Yeah. This is on Walnut Street, and it was built in 1923 through 1926. Actual stonework was accomplished by another stonemason, Harmon Lowmaw, under Folker's direct guidance. By 1926, Folker was getting to be a little beyond the ability to lift all those stones. The master was getting up in years. So this craftsman bungalow has Oriental influence details, like the unique roof lines and the trellised porch off to one side. And the 3 or 4, what is it? You can't tell from here, but I think there are 5 windows across the top. That's a craftsman bungalow, Oriental influence home. And they actually call that Oriental influence in the architecture books. So I'm not being politically incorrect. We don't call it Asian anymore. I mean, we don't call it Oriental, it must be Asian. But that is an actual style. Mr. Lowmaw must have been a good student, because this home is an example of William Folker's best stacked rock design, having the stones placed very close together to minimize the need for much mortar, with massive boulders placed on the bottom with increasingly smaller stones up to the top. The tapered porch supports and the pointed stones at the chimney are classic Folker details. The Seiler family lived in the home sometime after the Warners, who built the home, and they sold the house in the early 1950s to the Vanderweel family, and the Vanderweels still own the home. Many Argus kids remember playing what one of them called hide the penny on and around the porch. So I guess that, you know, if you hid the penny, you were not likely to be able to find it. And yeah, so that game could go on for a long time. In 1936, William Folker did his part in the building of the Isaac Walton League Clubhouse that sits on a piece of property east of Argus. Stonework was of veneer over framework, and while the 79-year-old Folker did not actually participate in the construction, he laid out the stones and he supervised the work. Apparently unconcerned about competition, Folker trained a number of other stonemasons over the course of his life. Chief among them was his brother-in-law, William Sissel, who worked with him for many years, and is in fact buried next to the Folkers in Maple Grove Cemetery. He worked with David Lowmaw, who did the Vanderweel porch, and Lowmaw had 7 sons. There was another man by the name of Clement Hammond, Louis Swihart, two other local stonemasons who were contemporaries of William Folker. In 1942, he completed his final project on the chimney of a house in Tyner. He cut the stone but allowed another mason to place them. And William Lake Folker died on September 3rd, 1942. He was 85. That man must have been strong to the very end for moving all that stone all of his life. Now we're going to move to Bremen. I'm going to run out of time before I run out of slides. But I kind of planned it that way so that we could just stop whenever we needed to. I promise I won't keep you longer than 1 o'clock. This is the Bowen house. The Dietrich family is responsible for more than one beautiful and unique building, but this house was built by the Dietrichs. Peter Dietrich built this home. We know it probably as the Bowen house because Governor Dr. Bowen lived there in the mid-1900s, and he had his practice there before he became the governor of the state. The large 3-story house is important as a surviving example of Queen Anne style of architecture, with its irregular projections, circular turret, porches with gable roofs. Peter Dietrich had built the house in 1900, a fitting residence for a prominent citizen of Bremen. Dietrich sold the house in 1922 to Frank Thomas, who sold it to Doc Bowen in 1953. It has recently been under renovation that is continuing. This is another one of those houses that we think would make a really good house tour.
It's got a gorgeous curved wall.
Oh, it
Yeah.
does,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, we took a field trip, and this museum staff did a little field trip to Bremen a year ago, maybe a little more, to see that house, and I'm telling you, it is stunning. It had a ballroom on the 3rd floor, which is now kind of a game room.
Yeah.
You know, but I couldn't understand the stairway to the ballroom is lit off a bedroom and real narrow
Yeah.
stairway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess only the most intimate companions of the family would, or if you didn't, I don't know how people with various and sundry issues ever got up and down those stairs.
And if you wore heels, my God.
Yeah, I think I'd be taking mine off. Yeah, but do drive by. If you get to Bremen, drive by just to see what they've done to the outside of the house. It's really neat. And just in case you are confused about the influence of the Dietrich family, this is another Dietrich house. A couple more architectural examples coming up. Construction in 1888 at the end of the Victorian architectural craze. Here is the home of J.R. and Anna Dietrich. The house is built on a foundation of boulders, capped by limestone blocks, with a decorative frieze, what they call a frieze, where the walls meet the roof. Bricks stand on end above the doors, and that's called a soldier course, when the bricks are standing on end. And although you can't tell from this photo, stained glass transoms added a lot of color to the front of this house. The tower on the northwest corner and the ornamentation on the original wood porch add a uniqueness. Additional details on parapets and balconies echoed this on the roof and the sides of the house. Large brick carriage house stood at the back of the property. That is a beautiful home. And so is that one. Also a Dietrich house. It was completed in 1890 for Christian Dietrich and his wife Mary. He was a partner in the family's general store, and he went on to build his own block of businesses in Napanee. So Napanee has a lot of Dietrich influence as well. The house's layout is cruciform, in other words, cross-shaped, with a corner tower that originally featured small peaks above the windows that were common to Victorian-era homes. Square bay windows, solid wood entrance doors are adorned with quality stained glass work. The carefully preserved doors are also embellished with carving. In the 1940s, part of the house was turned into a small apartment. I always think that's such a shame, you know, when these big houses get kind of cut up. The house was completely restored though in 2005 by Jim Wallace, who was careful to retain the original design and many of the historic details. Now I want to show you this Bremen building, the Bremen State Bank. I'm showing you this one because it was built by Peter Dietrich as the Union State Bank. This beautiful building was typical of its 1923 vintage. It's classical revival building. You can tell that by the pillars and the ornate arched windows above the center door, the rectangular windows. As a result of the Great Depression, that particular building went bust, and the building was purchased by the Bremen State Bank, which then moved from across the street. In 1967, the building's windows were blocked up and it was given a stone aggregate and steel facade. Okay, that's what it looked like for many years, that picture in the corner. Now look at that beautiful building. Doesn't that make you just want to weep?
Yes.
Yeah. Thankfully, the town of Bremen purchased the building in the 1980s and returned it to its original appearance in 1996. And before we leave the beautiful town of Bremen, which I guess we're going to have to do pretty quickly, you don't know where that one is? Yeah, we did that when we did the Bremen tour, this particular house. I have to show you this house on Washington Street. It built in 1900 and appears to be a simple turn of the century, what they call a gable front and wing house. So the gable and the wing. This type of home was built with little regard for changing architectural trends. It was a cheap style for people who just needed to have some place to live. Usually just meant to provide basic shelter. And it was usually constructed of easily obtainable materials for an area. They were made of whatever was local, brick, timber, rock, whatever. Take a good look at this one. Although not confirmed, it seems likely that the unique brick and stone patchwork pattern was created by a man by the name of Johann Eiger, the first recorded owner of the house. Doesn't say he built it, but he made his living as a stonemason. So the 15 by 18 black and white squares show a high level of precision, and the patchworks of stone are book matched. The porch, brick flower planter, and some of the other details were probably added later. You can see them well, you can't see them well under the porch ceiling, but there are vertical stonework insets between the doors.